I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but sometimes life drops something strange at your doorstep, literally, and you don't realize that it's the beginning of a story that will break everything you thought you knew about your family. I remember once, years ago, finding a small key outside my apartment door. No note, no explanation. I kept it for months, wondering if it was connected to some secret I wasn't supposed to know. Nothing ever came of it, but it stayed with me. That feeling of being watched, of being chosen for something you didn't ask for. Maybe that's why what happened to Mason struck me so deeply. His story didn't start with a key. It started with flowers. Mason told me that on a quiet Thursday morning in late spring, he opened the door of his downtown apartment and saw a single white lily resting neatly against the wood. No card. No message. No footprints. Just the flower, still fresh, tiny droplets of dew clinging to its petals. He picked it up, assuming it belonged to a neighbor. But when he asked around the hallway later that day, no one claimed it. He thought it was a mistake. A one-time accident. Something innocent. He had no idea it was only the beginning. Mason was 28, working as an assistant manager at a tech retail store. The kind of guy who kept his life organized, simple, predictable. He lived alone, mostly because he liked quiet evenings after long days dealing with customers. His father, Grant, lived 15 minutes away, in a modest house filled with old vinyl records and family photos that Mason barely remembered posing for. Their relationship wasn't bad, just distant in that way that sometimes happens when two people love each other but have never learned to speak the same emotional language. That next morning, Friday, another flower appeared. A rose this time. Pale pink, tied with a thin silver ribbon. Mason felt a jolt of confusion. Maybe someone was messing with him. Maybe it was a misguided romantic gesture. But even then, who would leave two completely different flowers, 2 days in a row, without a note? He asked his father over dinner that night. They were sitting at Grant's kitchen table, eating reheated lasagna and talking about Mason's job stress. Mason mentioned it casually. "Someone's been leaving flowers at my door." Grant's fork paused just slightly, so slightly Mason almost missed it. "That so?" his father said, forcing a small smile. "Probably kids or some weird neighbor." It wasn't a convincing answer. Mason felt it, even if he didn't know what it meant yet. I've learned over time that parents are terrible liars when something from their past comes knocking. They always freeze, just for a split second. A moment too fast for most people to notice, unless you're paying attention. By Monday morning, the flowers had become a pattern. Not just once or twice, but every day. Some days it was a small bouquet. Other days, it was a single stem wrapped in craft paper. Sometimes the flowers were familiar, sunflowers, roses, lilies, but other times they were strange, exotic varieties Mason had never seen before. And always the same detail, no note. No explanation. Mason started waking up earlier, hoping to catch the person in the act, but whoever they were, they worked fast. At 5:30 a.m. the flowers were already there, waiting. At 5:15 a.m. too. He even stayed up all night twice, pacing near the door with the hallway light off, listening for footsteps. Nothing. Whoever was leaving them was careful. Precise. Almost practiced. The situation went from odd to unsettling. Mason began feeling watched. Not in a paranoid way, more like someone knew his routine intimately, understood exactly when he was asleep, when he opened his door, when he checked. And I get that feeling. I think most people do. It's that itch in the back of your mind that tells you there's a story unfolding around you and you're the only one who doesn't know your role in it yet. On the 10th morning, Mason found something different. A single sunflower, the largest yet, with a tiny oval locket tied around the stem. Finally, something with meaning. He brought it inside, sat on his couch, and stared at the locket for several minutes before opening it. Inside, there was a small photo. Old, blurry around the edges. A woman with short dark hair, smiling. She looked like she was in her late 20s. Mason didn't recognize her. When he showed the photo to his friends later that day, no one recognized her either. But there was one person left to ask. That evening, he drove to his father's house again. When Grant opened the door, Mason showed him the locket without saying a word. The reaction was immediate. Too immediate. Grant's eyes widened, his face drained of color, and he had to grip the doorframe to steady himself. "Mason, where did you get this?" Mason explained everything, the flowers, the timing, the locket. Grant took the locket in his hands as if he were holding something fragile, something sacred. Then he whispered, "I haven't seen this in 30 years." It was the first crack in the wall of secrets Mason didn't yet know existed. Grant didn't explain further. He became quiet, withdrawn, insisting he didn't know why someone would leave that photo for Mason. But Mason could see the truth in his father's eyes. He recognized the woman. Whoever she wasn't random. Over the next week, the flowers continued. Sometimes with small objects tied to them, old coins, a dried leaf pressed between plastic, a fabric scrap from what looked like an old dress. Symbolic things. Personal things. Every time Mason tried to bring them to his father, Grant refused to look. He turned away, muttering that the past was the past. But the past wasn't staying there. It was showing up every morning like clockwork. By the 15th day, Mason was exhausted. He felt trapped in a mystery that seemed to grow heavier rather than clearer. His friends joked that he had a secret admirer, but he couldn't shake the sense that the flowers weren't about him at all. They were about his father. One night, unable to sleep, Mason pulled the locket out again. He stared at the woman's face, at her smile that seemed warm but shadowed by something melancholic. Who was she? Why now? Why flowers? Why him? He searched old albums in his father's house the following afternoon while Grant was out grocery shopping. Something he wasn't proud of, but by then he felt justified. Secrets invite invasion. He flipped through photo after photo, birthdays, school events, holidays. Grant as a young man, Mason as a child, a few unfamiliar faces here and there. But not once did he see the woman from the locket. It was as though she had been deliberately erased. That same evening, Mason decided he'd had enough. He planned to sit by the peephole all night if necessary. He needed to know who this woman was, if she was even alive, and why she kept leaving pieces of her story at his door. He made coffee. Brought a blanket. Turned off all the lights. And waited. Hours passed. Midnight. 1. 2. 3. Silence. No footsteps. No shadows. He fell asleep at some point, head against the wall, waking up with a jolt around 5:20 a.m. He rushed to the door, nothing. But when he opened it at 5:35, a flower was there. Placed so softly, so silently, that he hadn't heard a thing even while sitting inches away. This time it was a white rose. Fresh, crisp, wrapped with twine. And tied to the stem was a small torn page from a book. Only a single handwritten line remained. "I never meant to hurt him." Mason's stomach twisted. Hurt who? His father? Someone else? He took the page to Grant later that night, determined not to let his father dodge the truth again. But when he entered the house, he found Grant sitting alone in the living room, staring at a vinyl record spinning silently on the turntable. He wasn't listening to it. Just staring. Mason sat across from him. "Dad," he said softly, "I think you know who's leaving the flowers." Grant closed his eyes. Exhaled slowly, like someone preparing to walk through fire. "There are things you don't understand," he murmured. "Things I hoped would stay buried. But they aren't," Mason said. "They're showing up every morning." His father didn't answer. But his expression said enough. For the first time, Mason felt a strange mixture of fear and sadness settle into his chest. Secrets rot people from the inside. A few days later, everything changed. Mason had gone to visit his father after work. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the front lawn. He parked the car and stepped onto the walkway, right as he noticed someone standing near the porch. A woman. Short dark hair. Small frame. Wearing a simple cardigan and holding a bouquet of yellow wildflowers. She wasn't facing him. She was facing Grant. And Grant, he wasn't pushing her away. He wasn't confused. He wasn't angry. He was hugging her. Arms wrapped around her like he had been waiting for that moment for decades. The flowers in her hand trembled as she held onto him, her head buried against his shoulder. Mason froze where he stood. Time seemed to stretch, bend, warp around him. The woman slowly pulled away from Grant, lifting her head, revealing the same face from the locket. The same smile. Older now, softer, but unmistakable. Mason couldn't breathe. Everything he thought he knew twisted into something unfamiliar, something painful. Grant turned and saw him standing there. "Mason," he said quietly, guilt flooding every corner of his voice. I can explain." The woman looked at Mason with eyes full of something he didn't understand yet, sadness, regret, hope. Maybe all three. But what hit him hardest wasn't the mystery anymore. It was the realization that his father had known her. Had cared for her. Had kept a piece of her hidden. And Mason had no idea why. He stepped back, breath unsteady, heart pounding. "Who is she?" he whispered. Neither of them answered. Not at first. But the silence was already telling a story he wasn't ready to hear. When I think about the moment Mason saw that embrace, his father holding a woman he'd never seen before, a woman who'd been leaving flowers on his doorstep for weeks, it reminds me of those moments in life when silence feels heavier than any confession. I remember once walking in on a family argument when I was younger. No one spoke, but the tension was enough to fill the room. You don't need words to understand that something big, something life-changing, is unfolding. Mason felt that same weight pressing into him as he stood there on the lawn, unsure if he should step closer or run. Grant let go of the woman slowly, as if reluctant to break whatever bond had just reunited them. She wiped a tear from her cheek, her hands trembling around the wildflowers she still held. Mason watched her, trying to connect the dots that refused to fit into any shape that made sense. His father finally stepped toward him. "Mason," Grant whispered as though saying his son's name too loudly might break the world apart. "Please, come inside. We need to talk." Mason shook his head, not out of anger, but disbelief. His voice felt caught somewhere between betrayal and confusion. "Who is she?" he repeated. The woman took a small step forward. "My name is Lila." Her voice was soft but steady, the kind of voice that carried years of stories, most of them heavy. It wasn't enough. Just a name wasn't enough. Inside the house, everything felt too still. Mason sat on the couch, Grant and Lila took the armchairs opposite him. No one moved for a long time. It was as if each person was waiting for another to start, to break the quiet that wrapped around them like a fog. Finally, Grant leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. Before anything else, he began, "I need you to understand something. I never meant for this to fall on you. I never wanted my past to bleed into your life." "That's already happened," Mason said, his voice firm but not cruel. "Just, say it. Whatever it is. I'm tired of feeling like the only one who doesn't know what's going on." Lila closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again, eyes full of a sadness so deep Mason felt it ripple through him. "I knew your father a long time ago," she said. "Long before you were born." Grant nodded, shame creeping across his expression. "We were together," Lila continued. "Deeply. And quickly. We were young, and we were stupid, and we thought life would always make space for us. Mason felt a knot forming in his stomach. So you were lovers? Yes, she said quietly. But that doesn't explain the flowers, Mason replied. Or why you disappeared from his life. Or why you're leaving things at my door instead of talking to him directly. Lila exchanged a look with Grant. One of those looks that says, "Are you ready?" Grant wasn't. But he spoke anyway. "There's more," he whispered. "Much more." The room seemed to dim as he inhaled deeply. "Mason, years ago, before your mother, before the life I have now, Lila and I, we had a child." Mason felt his body go cold. Every sound vanished. Every thought crashed into a numb silence. A child? Grant watched his son's expression collapse into shock. "She was pregnant," Grant continued. "And we planned to raise the baby together. We had everything figured out. But life doesn't always follow the paths you map out." Lila's hands shook as she held the wildflowers in her lap. "I was young," she whispered. "And scared. And I made a decision I thought was right at the time. I left. Not because I didn't love Grant. But because I was terrified. I came from a background full of chaos, full of abandonment, and I didn't want to drag him into it. So one night, I just disappeared." Mason tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "What happened to the baby?" That single question seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Grant swallowed hard. "She was born," he said softly. "A beautiful girl. Her name was Elise." "Was?" Mason repeated. Lila wiped her cheeks. "She died before her second birthday. A congenital heart defect no one saw coming. I was alone when it happened because I was too ashamed to reach out to Grant. I thought losing her was my punishment for leaving." Grant looked like he'd aged 20 years in front of Mason. "I didn't know she existed," he whispered. "Not until months after her death. Lila came back and told me everything. I didn't handle it well. I was angry. Broken. I told her to leave, that I couldn't look at her without thinking about the child I never got to meet." The weight of that pain filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Mason felt it in his chest, his father's grief, Lila's regret, the long shadow of a child who never grew up. He took a long breath, trying to steady himself. "So what does any of this have to do with me? Why the flowers? Why show up now?" Lila looked at him as if searching for courage. "Because I never stopped thinking about your father. And when I heard through a mutual friend that Grant wasn't doing well, that he'd been dealing with health scares and pulling away from people, I panicked. I didn't know how to approach him after all this time." "And me?" Mason asked. "You look like you were meant to be part of that story," she said. "I saw you once, outside your father's house. And it hit me, your age, your face, something about your expression. It reminded me of the child I lost. I know that sounds strange. But I didn't want to disrupt your life by walking up to your door and saying, 'Hi, I'm the woman who broke your father's heart.' So I left flowers instead." Mason leaned back, letting the truth settle inside him like dust on old furniture. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't predatory. It was grief, guilt, and longing twisted together in the only way Lila knew how to express it. Still, there was one thing that didn't fit. "The locket," Mason said. "The note. The strange objects. They weren't just flowers." Lila nodded. "Every item I left belonged to Elise. They were the only things I kept." Mason's breath caught. The sunflower with the locket. The scrap of fabric. The little pieces that felt like breadcrumbs in a long-forgotten story. "She left them because she didn't know how to tell me," Grant said, voice breaking. "She wanted me to know she remembered. That she still loved her. That she still remembered us." Mason didn't know what to do with all that emotion. With all that history he had never asked for but now carried like a stone in his chest. He stood up, pacing, running a hand through his hair. I don't understand why after all this time you didn't talk to her, Dad. Instead of pretending she didn't exist. Grant sighed. Because I learned to live with the pain by burying it. And I knew if she came back, I would feel it all again. And you? Mason asked Lila. Why didn't you talk to him sooner? Lila's eyes softened. Because I didn't think I deserved forgiveness. The three sat in silence. The kind of silence that hurts because it reveals more than it hides. It took time. Mason didn't forgive instantly. Grant didn't heal instantly. And Lila didn't earn trust instantly. But something changed that night. Mason saw his father not as an unshakable figure but as a man with wounds deeper than he'd ever realized. Lila wasn't a ghost from the past anymore, she was a woman trying to make peace with her mistakes. In the days that followed, conversations slowly began. Not perfect ones, but honest ones. Grant and Lila talked for hours, finally stitching together the pieces of a story that had been torn apart decades earlier. Mason watched from the background, unsure of how he fit into all of it, but slowly realizing that sometimes you don't have to fit, you just have to listen. The flowers stopped arriving at Mason's door, replaced by something simpler and more meaningful, honesty. Bonds rebuilt. Wounds acknowledged. A past confronted rather than hidden. Mason found himself driving to his father's house more often, not because he needed answers, but because he needed connection. And though he never knew Elise, he felt her presence in the quiet moments, like when he saw the locket resting on the mantel, open to the tiny photo that once confused him but now felt strangely familiar. Life doesn't always give you the whole story. Sometimes it gives you fragments. A locket. A note. A face in an old picture. A hug on a front porch. And it's up to you to decide what you do with those fragments, whether you bury them or try to build something new. For Mason, it became the start of understanding his father in a way he never had before. Understanding that even the strongest people have chapters they can't read out loud. Understanding that love doesn't disappear, it only changes shape. And I guess that's what stays with me most about Mason's story, the way the past has a habit of finding us, no matter how well we think we've hidden it. I've seen this happen in my own life too, moments when something unexpected forces you to look at people you love a little differently, with more softness and less certainty. If anything, Mason reminded me that we're all carrying pieces of someone else's story, even when we don't know it. And maybe the real miracle is when those pieces finally come together, not to hurt us, but to help us understand who we are.